All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I'm Timothy Summers, your host for Innov8. Pardon my Outlook alert there. I think all of us have that life right now. It's an absolute pleasure that I introduce to you Helen Patton. Helen would be absolutely fine with me saying just that about her, but I just feel that I'd love to share a little bit more. We cannot welcome our esteemed guest without sharing a bit about her wonderful background. Helen comes to us with an amazing amount of depth and breadth in privacy, security, resilience, risk. She's a CISO at Cisco. She shares security strategies with the broader security community, as she's willing to do here with us today. And sharing her time. She previously was with CISO at the Ohio State University, where she was awarded the ISC North American Academic Public Sector Executive of the Year and an Executive Director at JP Morgan Chase. Helen is actively encourages collaboration across and within industries to enable better information security, privacy practices. Helen's just absolutely amazing, in my opinion. I have spent just a little bit of time reading her background. You probably, any geeks out there in the audience probably noticed she's got some really cool stuff, paraphernalia behind her if you're a Star Wars fan. But without further ado, I just want to thank you so much, Helen, for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's really great to be here.
Wonderful. Perhaps you could just start by sharing with us a little bit about you and your journey.
Yeah. So you can tell from the accent, I'm not really from Ohio originally. I grew up in Australia, but I was a young person when I moved from Sydney to Columbus, Ohio, thanks to I married a Navy guy. It's a war bride. So I moved to Central Ohio in the early 90s, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do with myself. Obviously, growing up in Australia in the 80s in the country did not come with it an expectation I'd be working in cybersecurity in the future. I think Commodore 64 came out when I was like in 10th grade or something like that. But when I came to Ohio in the early 90s, I accidentally stumbled upon working for a nonprofit organization that was migrating a membership database to this newfangled Windows 95 3.1.1 kind of network configuration. And I was the only person in the office under the age of about 30. And so they figured I must have some clue about this newfangled IT stuff. And so they scheduled me to work with the company that was helping us do a migration. And I ended up being hired by that company. And that got me into technology. And a really lovely guy who ran the company, Mike Taranto, taught me on the job how to do networking, how to do Windows builds, which at the time meant sitting in front of a PC and feeding in 16 to 25 floppy disks and hoping it didn't blue screen at floppy disk number 20 like that. It was so technically advanced at the time. And that pushed us into the end of the 90s, which sort of came around the Y2K software bug. We started to see I love you viruses and other sort of weird cyber stuff sort of starting to happen. And so I was working in IT at the time, running help desks and networks and that kind of stuff, infrastructure. And all of a sudden, these security things started to happen. And what ended up happening was two major events that happened. There was a power outage in the Northeast that started in Ohio. Actually, some weirdo power substation fell over somewhere near Cleveland, and it took out power from Detroit to New York for 2 weeks. And it just happened that the company I worked for at the time was headquartered in Detroit. So I was sitting in Columbus, Ohio. Headquarters was dark, and I was the only technology person left standing. And then 9/11 happened as well. So in that sort of space, people woke up and went, resiliency is a thing and security is a thing. And the CIO of the company at the time said, Helen, you should work in security. And that's got me started. And so I went from there to JP Morgan, and I spent 10 years at JP Morgan doing security stuff. And I left there to be a CISO at Ohio State. And I was 8 years the CISO at Ohio State. And now here I am at Cisco. So security was not an intentional career path, but it's actually been really good for me. So it's been a good run so far. Not over yet.
It's a really robust journey, right? I mean, can you share a little bit about, I imagine being in JP Morgan and being in other industries, very different
Yeah.
at the security lens. What was that like?
It was really interesting. JP Morgan, it's financial services, financial sector, so highly regulated from a data protection perspective, global company, so 70 countries, just as many regulators, if not more. And the culture at JP Morgan at the time was very top-down command control. So if Jamie Dimon, the CEO, said, we are going to focus on cybersecurity, which he did while I was there, then you did. And you did in a hurry, and you did. And then I left there and I went to Ohio State, which was higher ed, which was very distributed technology, which is every tenured faculty member can choose what kind of tech they want to use and how they want to use it. And there was no Jamie said kind of culture going on. It was, you've got to bring everybody along for the ride. And you didn't make a policy change unless there was a committee meeting, and an individual person in that meeting may disagree with you and you have to adjust to that. Like none of this majority rule thing. It's like minority influence, if not minority rule. Really very different. But the interesting thing was when I got to Ohio State, we were, as a security industry, we were trying to get away from being thought of as the team of no, right? And so there was a lot of investment at the time in the industry going into what's the psychology that would make someone want to be more secure, and how do you tap into that psychology and how do you apply it in a security program? And so I was actually pretty blessed to be part of higher ed when that thinking came about, because I was right in the petri dish of, if I couldn't convince people that security was a good thing, security then wasn't going to happen. So it was really fortunate that I was in higher ed when that sort of psychology of risk conversation started to happen in the industry. I learned a lot. It was an eye-opening journey.
I imagine so. I mean, the psychology of risk, the conversations around digital trust and security now, I imagine, from where you're sitting as CISO, what are you seeing out there in security? Where do you think it's headed right now?
I actually think it's on a journey, but it hasn't finished the journey yet. And I actually think IT is the same way, but IT is a little further ahead in terms of years. So, CIOs for the longest time did not sit in the C-suite, even if they had a C in their title, but they do now. We're looking at the CISO role and saying, where should the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer role, really sit? And there is certainly a thinking that says the CISO should sit as high up in the organization as they possibly can and probably report to the CEO, if not further. I think the pragmatists will say it doesn't really matter where the CISO sits as long as they sit somewhere where they can be effective. I think it's a bit of a Venn diagram going on that one. But I think ultimately companies and universities are waking up to realize that everything they do sits on information and sits on technology. And regardless of the industry you're in, you are first and foremost a technology company, first and foremost an information company. You may apply that and express it through the lens of higher education or financial services or healthcare. But there isn't a company out there today that doesn't have technology as a foundational element of what they do. And I think the long-term role of security and IT, on the IT side, it's making sure the data turns into knowledge. On the security side, I think it's not security for security's sake or privacy for privacy's sake. It's heading us towards being trustworthy. So can you trust your tech? Can you trust the information is sound, has integrity? But even more so, can you trust the organization to be trustworthy? And what's the role of a CISO or a CIO in that endeavor? And so I think over time, you'll see the role of CIO and CISO perhaps fall away. And we'll incorporate things into it like data management, ethics, privacy, artificial intelligence will fit in there somewhere. All of those sort of subsidiary element. I'm taking a CISO view here. Everything else is secondary to security when you're a security person, by the way. But all of those kinds of lateral things, adjacent things will wrap up together into one role, and it will become like a chief trust officer role or a chief digital officer role, but really with the focus on being trustworthy at the core of it. So kudos to ASU for having a title that already speaks to that, right? It's
Absolutely.
great.
I know you got an opportunity to hang out with our Chief Information Security Office and Digital Trust Officer,
Yes.
Donna. And it's such an amazing role. Donna and I get to talk about this quite often, and I just can't think of a more evolutionary period and role in security.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting because if you're in the security field, you can work in any industry, you can work in any location. There is a place for you almost anywhere. But people who start in security tend to think of it in terms of it's a technology function. The longer you're in it and the more mature you are within it, you come to learn that it's not a technology function. It's a business function. It's a societal function. It happens to be managed through the lens of tech, but it's not, tech isn't the primary purpose of it. And once you start thinking about it that way, you start to think about all the ways all the places that you play and why you play there. So as a CISO in higher ed, yes, you have students on campus or remote and you are protecting their data, and that's certainly a thing. But when COVID hit, for example, the security teams were called into those central conversations to say, not only do we care about the health and safety of the population and how do we continue to do higher ed learning and research while taking care of the health of the population, but then there was also what do we do around the data? How do we make sure that the data is protected confidentially, but also has integrity? How do we make sure that voting systems have integrity? How do we make sure that artificial intelligence algorithms are giving us an output which is correct and not as overly reflective of the biases of the people or the data sources that are feeding those algorithms? So when you think about security, you play in all of those spaces, which is really exciting if you're a tech geek, because there is no end to the tech or the geekiness that goes along with being in part of security, actually.
Look, Helen, like we talked before, right? Like conversation series of open doors, and you just opened this one a little bit. On the AI side, I mean, look, you started touching on an area that I'm really interested in, which is this explainable AI stuff, which is, right now, AI being so black box and not being able to explain to you the output. I mean, you're really touching on something interesting. And I'm curious what your thoughts are around the security policy stuff there.
Yeah, security policy is really interesting. So traditionally in the security space, we cared about CIA triad, which is confidentiality, integrity, and availability, right? All of those things still play, but there is a guy by the name of Sunil Yu. His last name is YU, and Sunil is a CISO, but he's really a big thinker in this space. And he's come up with the DIE triad, which security is known for really stupid shortcuts. DIE, distributed, immutable, and ephemeral, right? And I think where he's going with the DIE triad is to say, if you have technology and systems that are largely static, that are, I'm going to say old school, then the CIA triad is what you have to apply around those things. But as we think about artificial intelligence and cloud and the newer technologies that we have available to us today, the old CIA triad is less relevant. The DIE triad of distributed, immutable, and ephemeral makes much more sense. What do I mean by this? We need to move our systems towards being what Sunil would call anti-fragile, not just resilient, but anti-fragile, that it's continuously learning, it's continuously getting better, it's continuously improving. You need the DIE triad of the kinds of servers you have, that you don't really care about patching them if you just update them. And if something wrong happens to them, you just replace them, because they're not hardware based anymore, they're software based. The data is ubiquitous and self-correcting, right? All of those things. So what am I talking about here? I just packed a lot of stuff. Go look at Sunil's YouTube videos. Amazing guy. He talks about it in easily consumable terms, like you treat your technology like cattle, not like pets, right? All of which is to say that the amount of data that we're dealing with as a community, as the world, is big, getting bigger, changing more quickly. We can't use old things like know what assets you have, inventory your data, and know what's important. Like, it changes so fast, it's so interconnected. Artificial intelligence has the potential to help us with that. It also has the potential to go incredibly wrong. And so I think the journey for us as digital trust officers, not just security officers, is to make sure that we keep nudging it towards helpful and away from catastrophic. And that's the journey we're on now. And I think, we talk about the fourth revolution, we're heading into the fifth. And I think the fifth is going to be these kinds of topics and concerns, which is great.
Yeah, no, this is a really unique time for security. I mean, you're so spot on about the older models, right? And Sunil's model is quite, I mean, that's quite, I want to say evolutionary and a bit revolutionary in security. I mean, to even think about it from that perspective. So this actually brings up a really great point that actually you mentioned earlier, and we talked about. You were talking about the role that the CISO plays and where the CISO kind of sits in the organization, yep. And reporting and whatnot. Security, because security is so connected, as you also pointed out earlier, to all of the business that we do today. It's changing all the time. It's got to be absolutely wild for a CISO to even stay abreast of all of this. And how in the world is the CISO supposed to share that with everybody else?
Yeah, you can't. Especially when I was the CISO at Ohio State, I still do teach a class with undergrad students. And so I get a lot of questions where people are like, I'd like to get into security, help. Well, saying you want to get into security is sort of like saying you want to get into healthcare or you want to get into IT. Like, it's this huge field, and there are specializations within it. Someone could spend their entire life doing nothing but authorization and the security of authorization, which right now are things like passwordless and multi-factor authentication and continuous trusted access. And how does that all fit? And that's this one tiny piece of this huge profession. And so I think there is room in the tent for everybody to come in and play professionally if they want to. Everything from legal and compliance and being a lawyer around technology law and privacy law and all of those kinds of things, all the way through to what we traditionally thought of as the hacker in very not nice terms. But of course, hackers are professionals as well as criminals, aren't we all? Professionals and criminals. But, to be able to reverse engineer malware, to be able to hack into systems, to get really, encryption algorithms. Don't get me started about the security of Bitcoin and how do you, there is some really technically deep elements to the security profession as well. And we have to go all to that. As a CISO, though, you could play in all of those spaces. And one of the challenges of being a CISO is carving out enough time in the week to at least know what the terminology is, even if you're not in the weeds of the technology at any particular time. The role of the CISO really turns out to be more of a translator role, right? So we think about what the technology is. We think about what the risks of that technology may be. We think about the organization we are in and what the organization cares about. And then we've got to try and put that together in like cake ingredients and stick it in an oven and bake it and hope it comes out like a beautiful thing and not a dead flat souffle pancake. To be able to have that conversation, you can't spend your time being technically weedy, but you do need to spend enough time with technical people and have a technical background enough that you can have conversations and understand all those things. What is the tech? What is the process behind the tech? What is the risk of the tech? What does that mean to the business? What are the business values that are going to be compromised if something goes wrong with the tech? So networking, reading, podcast listening, all of those things are really big tools in a CISO toolbox. I've known people who are CISOs only after working in the industry 2 or 3 years, but they typically tend to be in a very specific vertical with a very specific technology focus. Companies, CISOs for companies that have a very big technical footprint, or even a university that just has a very big business footprint, tend to have a lot of years of experience behind them because they need that experience in order to be able to play that translator function. So it's a unique job in and of itself. But people 10 years ago would think of CISOs as being very technical people. And while there are technical CISOs that still exist, for the most part, they're actually business translators at this point.
Yeah, no, this is wow. You know, I'm curious. I know in my own experience in cybersecurity, I remember some years ago, you know, talking with a company about their CISO role. And I remember inquiring about it. I said, okay, so, you know, how many people are on the security team? And they said, well, it'll just be our CISO. And I said, well, so is there like any, like who actually like does, like, are there any technical people on the team? And they said, well, there's an IT team. And, you know, whenever you need something done, you can go to the IT team. And I remember thinking, good grief, this is a global company. Like you have such a very small team. Curious, Helen, in your experience, you know, are we still in that kind of an environment, or are we making our way to where, you know, we're starting to take this seriously?
Both, actually. I think there's a couple of things that go along with it. One is, you know, what industries are the companies existing in, and what are the expectations of security in those industries? So again, healthcare, financial services are sort of the poster child of highly regulated. We expect a high level of security maturity. There's going to be a high level of investment. There's expected to be a high level of investment in security. Security teams are really big, typically in those organizations. That's true. But at the same time, we have a lot of companies in the US and elsewhere that are startups, right? And so there's this great book written by a guy by the name of Chris Castaldo that's called Startup Secure. And it talks about how do you secure a startup? At what point do you actually need to bring in a dedicated security team versus a tech team who happens to occasionally think about security stuff? What does it mean if you are a technical team, if you're trying to do security for a company that's cloud native versus something that might be manufacturing where you've got a lot of widgets that just don't lend themselves to easy technology security solutions? So there's industries and levels of maturity within this industry, but there's also size of companies that change that. So we still see job descriptions for CISOs where they're looking for 2 years of experience and you're a team of 1. And at the same time, there'll be a CISO job description for a major bank that assumes many years of experience. You're going to have a team of hundreds of people and you're going to have budgets that run into the millions, if not billions of dollars. And they're both called CISOs. And this is one of the reasons why it's so confusing for job seekers, because even within that, that's CISOs, you know, security analyst, security engineer, security architecture, vulnerability management manager. Like there are all these terms that we think we know what they mean, but they all mean something different for every single company, depending on the maturity of where they are. It's really confusing, really confusing. So yes, and we're going to see both for a long time because that's the nature of business. Yeah.
Well, you know, we're in this in October, the spirit of Cybersecurity Month, right? Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And one of the things I was just so excited about having you here was, you know, you have been CISO at a massive university like the Ohio State University, right? I'm curious, what do you think, you know, what can schools be doing right now to grow the security profession, to help non-security people get into the field, become more discerning consumers, And not only that, how can we encourage more of our young people to get into cyber?
Yeah. There's a few things. So first of all, I'm going to wave my magic wand. And when I do, this is what I think should happen. I recognize this is rainbows and unicorns and it's a long way off, but you asked the question, so I'm going to answer it. I do think we need to make sure that general education, and I'll stick with 4 years for a second, like a bachelor's degree kind of program. We do need to make technology part of the basic general education curriculum. We need to make being a good digital citizen part of that curriculum. I'm not expecting everyone to code. Like what I've seen is a lot of schools that go, we're going to do cyber, and that means we're going to teach our kids to code. You don't need to code to be in security, and you don't need to code to be a really good digital citizen. I think things like understanding how your data is handled by companies, social media or otherwise, is a really important step of being part of the digital economy. Understanding the value of data is a really important part of being part of the digital economy. Understanding basic security controls that you can use to protect yourself personally, whether you become a security pro or not, needs to be part of the basic curriculum. We're starting to see it being taught in high schools, but not very much. So I'm still looking for colleges to be able to give that kind of thing. Yes, we need more security programs, but security professionals would argue that it takes so long to develop a curriculum in a 4-year college that by the time the curriculum is developed and approved, the technology it's based on is out of date. So I think there's a role for colleges, but they have to be much more nimble about the content of the courses. And I think partnership with private sector is going to get them there. So I know we have a tendency in the academy to say, if it's not created in the academy, it doesn't have the intellectual rigor it needs. We're going to have to think about slicing that down a little bit in order to stay abreast of technology. There is a post-grad role for deep technical rigor, but from an undergrad perspective, it's an exposure need at the moment. And so I think we need to think about it through that lens. Security should not be a subset of the computer science department. It should be its own college. It's its own discipline, and it needs to be thought of that way. So that's Helen waving her magic wand. I know that doesn't happen very many places. And I want cybersecurity, and particularly systemic risk caused by technology and information, to be a core part of an MBA program. We have too many C-suite executives and board members who have no exposure to the risks that technology and information pose to their companies, trying to make risk-based decisions. And that's a gap. So undergrad, digital citizenry, more nimble technology and dedicated cybersecurity classes, and then a post-grad focus on risk and systemic risk management, I think is what we're missing. We're seeing pieces of it. It's not that it's not there at all. It's just hard to find if you're a student. So we need to make it clear.
Wow. No, I think you just outlined a really amazing program right there, it sounds. But I love that you opened up about boards and the C-suite. This is an area that we could do a lot of work and improvement. What has that experience been like for you? What have you seen in the boardroom, and how can, what kind of improvements can do you see there?
Yeah, I think, by the way, I am seeing some changes at the SEC level in terms of what public boards need to be doing in this space. So I'm encouraged by some of the changes that I'm starting to see that way, but we're not there yet. I think the structures of the board need to be examined more closely. So in a traditional board, cyber risk and information risk is treated as a subset of operational risk, and it's typically handled by the Risk and Audit Committee of the board. The Risk and the Audit Committee of the board cares more about financial statements than anything else. So technology and security, when the board is set up that way, technology risk and security risk doesn't get the attention it deserves. So I would be calling for a board to have at least a dedicated technology subcommittee, if not a more board level exposure to cybersecurity stuff. It's that important. The second thing is we need board members who understand technology and security. And right now we just don't have a lot of those. There are efforts underway to make that happen. But right now, if you look at the qualifications that board members bring to the boards, there will be someone that will be tech, but their exposure is not operationally defending an organization or operationally being a CIO. Their exposure is, I used to sell technology products, or I used to be the CFO of a technology company. And so by osmosis, I magically know how to do technology now. And I think that's not good enough. If we can expect a board to have someone with a dedicated financial background, and we do because Sarbanes-Oxley requires it, we should also be requiring board members to have dedicated technical operational experience as well. And they don't have it right now.
That's a really good point, and I see that my friend John has put a question in the chat here, and it's very closely related to this. And he says, "How have things changed after all the big data breaches, and have you seen changes at the board level there?"
Yeah, so the SEC is starting to get involved, right? So there was a case, I'm going to get this wrong, but you can quote me on this, but know that it may be faulty. Caremark had a breach. I think Caremark had a breach. And the SEC fined the board because the board was not asking the right questions to have mitigated either the impact of the breach or to stop it from happening in the first place. So the SEC is starting to hold board members much more accountable for actually governing the program and not just delegating security or technology risk to some lower level manager in an organization. So we are starting to see some changes in the board at that level for those reasons. I think the other thing that has really woken boards up is ransomware, frankly. People were like, from a risk perspective, we can handle fines related to confidentiality and privacy. But what they really suffered from was when a ransomware event happened and the whole purpose of the organization ground to a halt, whether that's gas pipelines with Colonial Pipeline, or there's a hospital in Georgia right now that's being sued because they had suffered a ransomware breach. The hospital had opened back up before all their systems were back online, and a woman giving birth to a child, the child died because the monitoring capabilities weren't in place because of the previous ransomware event, right? So there's a number of those kind of what I would classify as availability issues that are coming up because of cyber events that boards are now visibly being held accountable for. And so, yeah, we're going to see some of that stuff. And yeah, Barnaby, the SEC, that we're seeing it. There is some legislation that's going through, at least in the US federal government. I think it's also happening in Europe and Asia as well, related to this, but we're hopeful actually we'll see some US legislation specifically around board responsibilities related to cyber within the next 12 months. That's depending on how effective our federal government is in passing legislation, but girl can dream.
we can hold our breath.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit too about just the sheer amount of change in the field and how quickly it happens. From your lens, what does it take to be a lifelong learner in security? What does that mean?
Oh, it's a buzzword. We're really good at buzzwords in the security industry. Have you noticed? Lifelong learner. I don't know of anyone who can't be a lifelong learner and just breathe it these days. I think the challenge for security people is because the field is so big and so changeable, it's working out how to consume information in an efficient way because there's just so much of it. So one of the things that I talk about when I'm mentoring people is, one, being really clear on what they personally value and what they're personally interested in, and owning that. Like there is a big, I'm going to use the word imposter syndrome, although I know there's all kinds of research that says imposter syndrome is a bad term and it's a myth in and of itself. But I see men and women in the industry, males and females, and everyone on the spectrum, who feel like they don't know enough as security professionals because the field is so big. Well, the reality is you can't know everything. And there are some things you have to choose to let go of and then focus on the rest. So if you're really interested in governance, risk, and compliance, then don't worry about learning how to code. You don't need to learn how to code to do that. On the other hand, if you really geek out on encryption algorithms, don't worry about learning what the NIST framework says about encryption algorithms. It's not going to help you out that much, right? So know what you value, know what is of interest to you, and then go deep on those kinds of things. And then in going deep, it is read as much as you can, network with people who work in those fields so that you're constantly seeing new information come towards you. Again, podcasts, things like this, huge value in terms of staying abreast of what's happening in the industry. And I think the other thing is you've got to be willing to let go of old things, right? I will tell you, when I was at Ohio State, when we started, I was really big into phishing the employees and the students. I thought it was a great training exercise. I thought it was, and there was certainly metrics that would tell me, you know, when people knew that they were about to be phished by me, they paid more attention to email in general. We saw phishing rates go down. There was a blip, right? But I actually think the psychology backlash to that is worse. So my personal, and feel free to fight me on this, I'm going to be at EDUCAUSE next week. You can come find me. We can have a knockdown, drag out fight about it. But my sense is there used to be value in that, but the sophistication of people doing phishing has got so big that I think there are better ways to spend training and awareness dollars than that. I had to let go of that. And I think this is what you're going to find if you want to stay in the security world, is something that you would have sworn up and down was so important and such a foundational thing. 10 years from now, 5 years from now, probably not so much. And you're going to have to give it up. So that's hard.
I actually couldn't agree more with you. And we should absolutely catch up at EDUCAUSE. And it doesn't sound like we'll be fighting on that one. We'll find something else to debate on. Okay. But, yeah. You know, I do have I wanted to ask you, you know, I know that, you know, you're working on some amazing things right now. Maybe you can share with our audience what kind of cool stuff, you know, for you, like what are the cool things you're working on right now that you're really excited about?
Oh, yeah. In no particular order. So one of the things I was privileged enough to be able to do when I was still the CISO at Ohio State is to engage with the cyber canon. So Ohio State created an Institute for Cybersecurity and Digital Trust. There's that trust word again. And I was co-creator of that, but that institute houses the cyber canon. So I can put it into the chat, but the cyber canon was started by a guy by the name of Rick Howard when Rick was the CISO at Palo Alto. And he realized, he's a big reader, and he realized there was no place where he could go to find books about cybersecurity that had already been curated by cybersecurity professionals. Like, there's a lot of books around cyber in the marketplace, but who's got time to read all the books to find out that they're crappy, right? So he created a committee of people who were cybersecurity professionals like me, and we review the books over the course of the year, and we write those reviews and we put them on the website. And so if you're in the cyber industry and you're looking for a book on, I don't know, cryptography or hacking or GRC or cybersecurity metrics, actually a lot of my books back here are cyber canon books. We've already read them, we've given a review, and within those reviews, sometimes we will recommend a book for the Hall of Fame. So Cliff Stoll's book, The Cuckoo's Egg, which is an oldie but a goodie, is a Hall of Fame winner and Hall of Fame winners are books that we think someone would be missing. If they were in security as a security professional, they would have a hole in their knowledge if they hadn't read the book. So that website is out there. We continue to meet as a committee and we do that. And I read, so I'm a geek, and I really like that. That's one. Professionally, right now, I am getting involved in questions around continuous trusted access. So one of the things that is sort of the promise of the future is zero trust, right? And everyone's heard about zero trust. But a core component of zero trust is saying, you don't just give access to something and then forget it. You give access to something or someone, and then you continue to monitor that access over time. And if the security profile changes during that session, you then take action. You might cut them off from being able to access the application, or you might ask them to re-authenticate, or there might be some other thing that happens. This is pretty nascent in the industry actually at the moment. So I'm getting to work with a whole bunch of really smart engineers, not just in Cisco, but there's an OpenID forum. Folks from Microsoft and Google and other places are part of that as well. And talking about how would you do that at scale, right? How do you enable an identity system or an application to know when Helen is all of a sudden maybe doing something that's a little bit weird, or Helen's machine just got infected by malware and we don't want her machine to access our network anymore, those kinds of questions. So super excited to be working on that kind of thing as well. And then from a hobby perspective, I am working with boards actually. So doing some training with boards around how to think about systemic risk. And one of the things that is really interesting to me as security professionals historically, we've always said, think about what you care about. We call them the crown jewels. Think about what you care about. And you can't spend money everywhere. So you've got to decide where you're going to put your focus. And we put the focus on the important things, and that's going to mitigate most of our risk, right? And I think there's still a little bit of truth to that. But the reality is our systems are so interconnected now that just having a low risk, publicly facing, publicly available website could take down your crown jewels. And so we used to say, well, let's put our focus where we have the most number of records, for example. That's a good thing. Yeah, it makes sense on paper. But when you think about systemic risk and the fact that, that cleaner with the vacuum cleaner who plugs her iPhone, we had this happen at OSU once, by the way. At night, she would come in to clean the office. And while she was cleaning the office, she plugged her personal phone into the computers at the desktop to charge her phone. It would not have raised to the level of being important enough for me as the CISO to care about. But guess what? It caused a HIPAA violation, right? So these are some of the things that we need to help the boards think through, this systemic risk question. And I'm geeking out on that too, for fun.
Cool things to geek out on. I mean, important things. This has just been such an amazing conversation. And you mentioned systemic risk, and I just, it just reminded me to kind of the curriculum you were talking about earlier. Please, thank you for sharing that link for the Cyber Canon. Like, I'm super excited about that myself. So, if there are any other questions, want to encourage the audience to share them here for Helen. This has just been absolutely wonderful to have to hear your story, for you to share it with us. I kind of curious, while seeing if we have a few other questions come in, curious, when you think about what's happening right now with remote work, what are you seeing in terms of the impact in the security field around that?
I think in some ways, it's a continuation of what had already begun a while back. But I think because of COVID, thank you very much, silver lining, maybe it's accelerated some of the issues that we've seen. For me, the question for security is less around remote work and more around how do we decide to secure environments that we don't own and we don't manage, right? So if Helen's sitting at home, by the way, Helen's sitting at home on a device that she personally owns, connecting through a network that she personally owns, or at least has the contract with the provider with, right? Connecting to a cloud-based application that the company doesn't own either. The company sort of rents the space on the SaaS application. But the poor security team, who's nowhere in that path, has responsibility to be able to manage that. And what we've seen over time with security vendors is they've really doubled down on being able to manage the things that they can physically see and they can physically touch. So there's a lot of really mature products around securing servers, network devices, endpoints, but data is still a real challenge. And as we've done remote working, or we've done distance learning, or we've got people working from home because of COVID now, really we need to get the security controls as close to the data as we possibly can. And the solutions available to us are actually still a little bit immature. And so I think this is where we're going to see now more investment being made. And then there's a question for people as to how much accountability they want to have over managing the security of that data. And if they don't want accountability, how much autonomy and privacy are they going to give up? So as individual people, as employees, but also as citizens, again, this question of what's our role as digital citizens? What are we willing to do for ourselves versus what do we expect somebody to do on our behalf? And in doing something on our behalf, what kind of freedoms are we giving up as a result? So it's going to be a really interesting public policy conversation, technology policy conversation, and privacy conversation, to be honest. It's a big gnarly thing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And on a concluding thought, I got a question for you. It used to be that we would say with breaches, it's not a question of if, but when. Does that still hold true?
I think if you're in a defender role, I think that's true. There's a part of me that sort of goes, okay, so what? So let's say it is a matter of when. It's inevitable. Something's going to happen. What we're already seeing is the community writ large is really fatigued by things around confidentiality, right? So everyone here has had some letter from some company that says, we take your privacy and security seriously, but here's the data that we lost on your behalf. Good job, us, right? We've all had it. We've had to give up credit cards. So I think the impact of data loss from a confidentiality perspective, it's like, meh, so what, right? Now, our regulators still care about it because that's where all our regulations focus right now. They're very privacy focused, which is great. More changes needed there. But I think what we're seeing from a security perspective now is this, like I said, focus on availability because of ransomware. So where do we have systems that as a society, if those systems are unavailable or not working the way they should be working, that it's a problem for us? And this is why we're seeing federal, state and local governments getting whacked all the time and it being a problem. When local governments get hit, our 911 systems go down. When hospitals get hit, people die. Like, this is a cyber event with a physical outcome. People care about that. We haven't resolved for that yet, but we will. And then I think the question again goes back to this integrity question. And we get into things like voting system integrity, but we also get into things like deep fakes. And is the Third World War going to be escalated by a deep fake YouTube video of a foreign national government leader saying something that sets something off and we don't realize it's a fake? Those kinds of questions make my head explode. But that, I think, is going to be the next evolution of an industry focus that we're going to have to think about. Yeah, just to leave you on a happy note.
Wow, ladies and gentlemen, Helen Patton. Thank you so much, Helen, for this time. I really had a lot of fun preparing for this and just, learned so much from you today.
Yeah. Well, I hope if people take nothing away, and I'm not just pushing OSU because I'm ex-OSU. Look at my OSU paraphernalia over here. Go OSU. Go take a look at the cyber canon. A lot of the things that we talked about today, there are books in the canon that do discuss those topics. And if you want to do a book review of your own and get credit for your book review, you can do that there as well. So hopefully you find it really useful.
Absolutely. And we'll make sure to share that link out. This was wonderful. Thanks again for the time, Helen. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for Innov8. And we're looking forward to seeing you next time. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.